Well, anyway, we'll get started on it then. Okay, let's go through this. So there were a few things he said about the global cooldown justification. You know, it went on for a good 13, 14 minutes, and one of the things he said that I thought was really interesting. So, well, I'm not going to say in exactly what order he said things. I may get that wrong, but one of the things he certainly said was that it's better, instead of just saying to us the whole system's trash, you should say specifically what the issue is. So then he said, oh, and actually they've looked at it and they're going to decide to take some things off the global cooldown again. Now, one of those things was Heroic Leap for Warriors. Now, I mean, I'm in favour of that. You know, I keep saying movement speed, things like that shouldn't be on the global cooldown because they're used reactively. They're not always used reactively. Sometimes they're used as part of a plan. And if they're used as part of a plan, it's not an issue being on the global cooldown because you know when you need to use it and you just, you know, make sure you're not going to be globaled. But when it has to be used reactively, it's split second stuff. Now, here's the thing. So I immediately, when he said that, and maybe there's a warrior here who can help me out, but in actual fact, it doesn't really matter, but it'd be useful anyway. I immediately thought to myself, so why should a warrior movement ability not be on the global cooldown, but other ones be on the global cooldown? Now, I wondered if someone had said something, you know, because obviously I'm not looking at lots of posts from other classes and specs to which I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. So if warriors have been presenting sensible arguments for why Heroic Leap should be off the global cooldown, which of course I would agree with, but I agree with it for all movement speed things or movement abilities. What was the specific reason for that? But then he said something which might have explained it. You know how a couple of Q&As ago he said they want to double down on the class uniqueness. They don't want, you know, different classes to have basically the same ability. But last night he seemed to be suggesting that he is okay with the concept of if they're slightly different, then all of a sudden that's okay. So what he did is he said something like, I think the Wild Charge was the example he used. So that on the global cooldown, and he said, but then something like Shadow Step, which is very similar, off the global cooldown. He said that's okay because, you know, Shadow Step, rogues, ninjas, blah, 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 you know, some cobbler's explanation. And that makes it special for them. So now what he's saying is the decision as to whether or not to have something on the global cooldown or not, which is to all intents and purposes for the same thing for different classes. The decision is not a gameplay decision. The decision is all about this bullshit philosophy of making some classes have basically the same ability, but there's some subtle difference between it. That undermines his whole argument about it being for gameplay reasons and about it being for the good of the game and the future health of the game. Because he's basically saying he is willing to take it off the global cooldown just to make it a little bit special for that class. And, you know, I mean, of course, I'm not saying I disagree. I mean, you know, you've got to take it off the global cooldown for Shadow Step because otherwise no one would ever take rogues in a raid, would they? I mean, bloody hell. Rogues have a massively difficult time getting into raids, as we all know. So there was that issue that I just thought, bloody hell, you've just, you know, undermined your own argument. But then there was another thing. And again, it's one of these things that if you genuinely believe in it, if it was me and I was Ian Hazzikostas and I genuinely believed that putting virtually everything on the global cooldown was important for the health of the game, I would give a scenario to demonstrate it. Now, he did give a scenario, but he deliberately gave a nonsense scenario. So let me just go through the scenario he went through if people didn't see it. He said, imagine you're a healer in a dungeon. Tanks suddenly drop down to 10% health, but you're on about 40% health as the healer. And then some fire spawns under you. So now you're in a situation where you're going to take some damage. The tank's obviously on 10% health. We know the tank's going to be taking damage. And it's about, you know, the skilled players are the ones who can go through and make that decision really quickly. And he was talking about combining Wild Charge with various heals and stuff like that. Now, because to begin with, he was saying, oh, you might use this heal, you might use that heal, you might heal them, you might heal them. Which is a nonsense, because that's got nothing to do with the global cooldown argument. Because all the heals are on the global cooldown, as they should be. Obviously, throughput abilities should be on the global cooldown. But then when he'd finished rambling and talking shit, he then said, so what you would do if Wild Charge was off the global cooldown, as of course I would want it to be, you would just use Wild Charge whilst you're healing the tank. So you get yourself out of trouble and you heal the tank. And he says that's a no-brainer. But the fact of the matter is it's a no-brainer either way. Because if you look at the scenario, so you're in fire, you're on 40% health. The tank's on 10% health. What do you do? Well, it's simple as this. Can you heal the tank up before they take enough damage to kill them? And still heal yourself before you take a tick from the fire that kills you? If the answer is no, someone's going to die either way. So you're in an impossible situation. In fact, in that particular situation, what you would do is you would sacrifice the tank. Because in a situation like that, although you might be screwed either way, you would sacrifice the tank and hope that a DPS could step up and do some kiting or tanking, or that maybe you could. It's better to have the healer live than the tank, ironically, in that situation. But assuming you're not both buggered, then there's still no real decision to be made. You just heal the tank up and then heal yourself up, or, you know, heal the tank up and move out of it. You know, none of these things require split-second decisions. Or you just need to know how much fire is that going to do to me. Only experience can tell you that. How often does it tick? Only experience can tell you that. You know, and is the tank about to take 10% of its health and therefore die? And only experience can tell you that. So you'll either sacrifice the tank, or you'll be able to heal both of you up. And it's not a decision to be made. It's triage. It's the sort of thing healers do all the time. And it has nothing to do with the global cooldown. Zero to do with the global cooldown. And when he was talking about, you know, range DPS and movement, he says, you know, range DPS hurt by movement. Again, that's got nothing to do with the global cooldown issue, because the when you're just having to move and take DPS off to move, if you use a movement speed thing, all right, that's like whatever the global cooldown is for you, that you're going to lose some DPS on. Well, big deal. No one really cares about that. Even parsers don't care about that, because the whole point of parsing is you compete with everyone else who's got the same situation anyway. The issue when it needs to be reactive, it's like something's appeared there, you've got to use that movement speed immediately. And if you've, you know, and it's only just happened, but you only have your natural reaction time to react to it. And if you don't react to it within that things in this game can kill you within a global cooldown. And that's just a fact. You know, for me as a Retribution Paladin, it's not even that big a deal, because everything's on the global cooldown anyway. The only thing they've taken off me is Shield of Vengeance and Avenging Wrath. Well, I can cope with that. But for, you know, my movement speeds and my proper defensives were always on the global cooldown anyway. So, you know, I'm not losing anything by having those two abilities put on it. But for some other classes, it's appalling. You bet the Shield of Vengeance would be off the global cooldown come live? I really wouldn't care for it. I don't give a monkeys. For me, Shield of Vengeance is actually not... It's not something used reactively. If it's not used reactively, I'm not that bothered about whether it's on the global cooldown or not. Because it'll be a simple situation. With an ability like that, is it worth it offensively? Is it worth a global cooldown? If the answer is no, I just won't use it. If the answer is yes, I will use it. Again, there's no decision to be made. It's either going to be worth it or it is not. And it's not one of those things you have to think split second. It's either always worth it or it's never worth it. Or maybe the only time you use it is when there's any thinking to do at all, where you've got some downtime, because of course there's downtime in it, and where you also know you're going to take enough damage from it. Yeah, I mean, tanks dying is now going to be a much more regular thing because... Not so much because of anything to do with the healers. I mean, in a raid, I think it's probably less severe because although tanks do have some responsibility for their survival, of course, that's mostly in terms of mitigation. Healers are usually on top of it and will adapt. You know, raiders will adapt to this new dynamic. Where it's a big problem is in smaller group stuff, you know, dungeons, where a tank can easily get globaled on, you know, their self-heal, like, you know. Like Light of the Protector, as was noticed there. Oh, well, you can't really pull, you know, so you're saying Ian raids Resto Shame his guild is currently 10 out of 11. I thought they'd actually killed it, actually, but, I mean, I wouldn't pull that one. He's a good raider. He knows what he's doing. Sometimes as well, I don't know to what extent... I don't know how it works at Blizzard. I don't know to what extent, even though he's director, that he really gets to yes or no everything. Because obviously any good leader is going to work on a teamwork base, but you don't just insist on everything. That being said, the fact that he always does the Q&As, or almost always does the Q&As, no one else does. I don't know whether that's because he's the only one who really wants to, other people don't want to, in which case, fair play to him. Or is it because he doesn't like other people doing it, in case they say something he doesn't want them to say? In which case, that's him being controlling, and therefore he is exactly the sort of person that would yes or no things, and it makes no difference what the majority of even games developers think. So I don't know what the relationship is there. But I do know he does understand things from a raiding point of view. He's not an idiot. And he's not someone who is not versed in high-end raiding. He is. It's just that there are reasons for things, but the reasons are not what they say. Like, when they come up with nonsense, it means that either he doesn't believe in what he's talking about, or he doesn't think he can give the real reason for what he's talking about. Which is baffling in this case, because the global cooldown thing is something that nobody asked for. Because another interesting thing he said at the start is he said, you know, why would we come up with a system that nobody likes? It, you know, it makes no sense, blah, blah, blah. So therefore, we're taking it because of the long-term health of the game. So why is he not able to give any examples of what threat GCDs pose to the game? Because coming up with examples of, you know, oh, this healer could use wild charge and heal the tank at the same time. As if you have to make decisions. Like his idea that you have to make these quick decisions and that's the skill of a good player is a nonsense, because it's not a decision you're making. In exactly the same situation, you would do the same thing. In other words, it's things that are worked out in advance or after mistakes. You know, you get into a situation, you don't deal with it properly, you learn, you think to yourself, oh, what I should have done was that. So the next time that situation arises, that's what you do. Because I'd be thinking as it, you know, from a healing point of view, and I'm not a healer, of course, but I would be thinking to myself, in that situation, if the tank lives and the healer dies and there's still quite a long way to go on that boss fight or trash pack, whatever it happens to be, well, can the tank keep themselves alive? Because here's the thing. If the tank could keep themselves alive without the healer long enough to finish that encounter, trash or boss, well, then the tank wouldn't have been in a difficult situation on 10% in the first place. So the fact that there was an actual decision to be made means that the tank can't look after themselves, in which case, why sacrifice you as the healer for the tank? So in a situation where you've got to make a decision one or the other, you will choose to save the healer and hope that other people can kite, stroke, tank the boss while the rest of you kill it, which of course does happen. Or you're in a situation where it's actually possible to heal both of you. You know, heal the tank first, then heal the healer, because you know your 40% health is enough to survive the next tick, in which case, again, there's no decision to be made. These are the things that you just work out from experience. I would like to hear, and that's what I mean. He didn't give examples that were actually realistic. And I also find it baffling that they've put the GCD, in their own words, they put the GCD on. One prime reason, one massive reason they gave was because of what they termed the Swifty macros with warriors. Having lots of these little cooldowns, or Fury warriors specifically, of course. And then they're saying, okay, so we'll put Heroic Leap back on the cooldown. You know, we're going to change the way some of those cooldowns work. Well, then why didn't they just do that in the first place? There were lots of things they could have done. So it sounds to me like what they're doing now is they've put this GCD thing in to fix what they see as a problem. Not everyone else sees it as a problem as well, it's worth noting. And now they're having to come up with other fixes to deal with the fix they've put in. If ever you put a fix into any system, whether it's a game or whatever, and then you have to come up with other fixes to fix the fix, you know that something's wrong. You've done something wrong. I think there's a reason, there's some reason they must have come up with. Because he is right about one thing. They're not just coming up with it to piss people off. There will be a reason. They're just not giving their genuine reason. They're not telling us the reason. You know, and that's what a lot of people are upset about. I noticed a couple of people very upset about it last night. It's the bullshit, the obvious bullshit. But then, as I said, the thing is, when people come up with bullshit reasons, you think to yourself, well, why would you do that when no one's going to believe you? But that's the thing. A lot of people will, because a lot of people, I mean, a lot of the people watching that Q&A wouldn't necessarily even know what global cooldowns really are. They certainly won't play with them. You know, most players will, you know, when they're using an ability, and then they use another ability, and then another ability. They're not thinking to themselves about how to maximize the number of casts they get off. So for a lot of players, they don't get the issue, and therefore when he says something that seems to make sense, they go, oh yeah, that makes sense. Just, in fact, Law, it's his phrase, isn't it? Makes sense. Makes sense. In fact, did you notice that Ian actually made Law say that at the end? When he'd finished talking, they were going to move on to the next question. He said to him, I'm going to say makes sense then? He went, makes sense. So, you know, I mean, but it also was interesting to note that, because when they said, in the original post, when they were talking about it, and they said, you know, leave your feedback. And at the time when I did the first video on it, and I said there's certain things you can tell they don't really want. They only want feedback that supports their principal design. And there's certain things you just from experience, you know, they don't want feedback telling you it's not good. And then he pretty much said that. He said, we don't want feedback telling us to get rid of the system. We just want feedback on what particular abilities are causing trouble. In other words, he will, for a few lucky classes that either, I don't know, for whatever reason, somehow get the oil on this one, the squeaky wheel that gets the oil. For a few lucky classes, some abilities will be taken off the global cooldown. That way they get to pretend that, you know, they're listening and they accept that in certain situations you can have it off and in others you can have it on. But I don't understand why one class should have an ability off the global cooldown and another class who would use it in exactly the same circumstances would have it on. I do not understand that. Yes, he said Hunters will get the disengage. So what did he say? Hunters off the global cooldown, Shadow Step for Rogues off the global cooldown, Heroic Leap for Warriors off the global cooldown. I don't remember them saying any others, but obviously that's not an exclusive list, or exhaustive is really what I mean. So they may say other things as well. Yeah, Heroic Leap, definitely. You find it funny that Law went along with everything when his pre-Blizzard persona would surely have raised his eyebrows. But absolutely. But this is the thing. I don't blame Law for that one iota. His job as a community manager, he's a PR guy. It is to find an accord between the customers, sorry, listen to my voice, between the customers and the company. But obviously he is an employee of that company and will therefore toe the party line. I would do the same for my workplace.